What is up, my beautiful Recovered on Purpose family? I'm so happy you're here for this week's episode of Guest Sundays right here on the Recovered on Purpose show. Super excited about my guest today. I was a guest on his podcast earlier this week. If you haven't seen that yet, check it out in the show notes. I've got the link there. Guys, we're going to have a great conversation about the stories you tell yourself in your mind and how to change your self-talk. Love you guys. Enjoy the show and keep living Recovered on Purpose.
The black represents the darkness from which we came. The white represents the light in which we now live. And the red represents the passion it takes to live Recovered on Purpose.
All right, welcome everybody. Super excited you're here. We're about to have a great conversation. My friend Matt Gardiner is here, and we're going to have a conversation about the stories you tell yourself in your mind about the things that happened in your addiction, in your past, and how we can actually change our self-talk to motivate ourselves and to progress in our lives in recovery. So it's not the circumstances that get you. It's your story about the circumstances that get you. Matt Gardiner is a recovery coach, a story work coach who has helped numerous people get out of their stuck stories and manage their addictions to effectively integrate sobriety into their lives. His coaching method focuses on breath awareness, inner dialogue, word choice, and reframing the stories you've been attaching to the events of your life. Change your story, change your life. Matt's 4 pillars of recovery are community, accountability, redefine, rediscover. Matt is also a lifelong musician and sound therapist, which complements his work as a coach. Beyond Recovery is a podcast hosted by Matt, where guests come on to share their journeys of recovery. And again, if you haven't seen that episode that him and I did earlier this week, go ahead and check the show notes, and the link is in there. All right, without further ado, I got my boy Matt. What's up, Matt?
Adam, man, thank you so much for the that intro. That was badass. And like, dude, what a show. I love the intro, everything. I'm really happy to be here. So yeah, great to see you again.
Good to see you, brother. Yeah, and my friend, my producer, made that intro for me like at the very beginning of the show, and every time I hear that rock music, I'm like, let's go.
Totally, man. Yeah, it changed my whole. I was like, I sat up straighter. I'm like, let's do this. Yeah, let's go.
Let's go. So you guys at home, sit up a little straighter. Let's listen to the show. And guys, drop in the comments any questions you have and things that are going on in your mind, and especially any stories while we're going through this, any stories that come up for you that you're thinking about. And, we're going to talk about how to reframe those stories so that you're able to step into your calling in life. So Matt, before we get into all that, why is it that you work with people in recovery? What is your story, and why it is that your heart is for the people in recovery or to find recovery?
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for the opportunity. So myself, I grew up big drinker, so on both sides of my family, my dad was always a big drinker. My uncle Paul, specifically on my mom's side, and I remember they'd get together, and that was sort of my origin story of drinking, was listening to them in the other room. And I noticed as like 5-year-old or 6-year-old Matt would hear like the music get turned up. They started yelling at each other, but it sounded very fun. And I was like, what is going on in that room over there? Right. And I'd go over and they do that. Hey, Matt, come in here. You got to try something. Got something for you. Right. And then they hand me a beer, and I do like the bitter beer face, and, oh, how can you possibly, how can you drink that? And they have a chuckle. So that was my first drink, quote unquote.
5 or 6 years old.
Right. Just a little sip of beer there. And, there was something about that. Like I've always had a bit of like an inner rebellious streak, and and so it appealed to me. I was like, there's something about them going into that room and turning up the music that appealed to me, right? So that was my earliest memory of my getting introduced to alcohol. And fast forward into my teenage years, my parents got divorced when I was 13. So where I'm from, Prince George, British Columbia, Canada, it's about 70,000 people. Very blue collar. It's like a mill town. A lot of forest parties. Used to call them pit parties. The burning the pallets down in the forest. And a lot of that going on, right? I was a little hesitant to get into drugs and alcohol initially, but when I did, I think part of me knew that I had a bit of an addictive personality, right? So by the time I did, though, I was smoking weed and daily by the time I was 16, and drinking every weekend or every other weekend. But by the time I was 18, I was drinking 4 or 5 times a week. You know, I got into psychedelics in my 20s there, like quite often, you know, microdosing before microdosing was a thing. Right. You know, so, and then getting into music and such was like, I was always an athlete up until about 15 or 16. I found that like when I was practicing, it was good, but as soon as the competition turned up a little bit, I had a real tough time with my emotions. I was a very much an emotional player. You know, and
What
then
sports did you play?
so I did, yeah, volleyball. I was in taekwondo. I'd play basketball, baseball. Strangely enough, I'm Canadian. I've never had a pair of skates on my feet. I never played hockey, but yeah, those, and Greco-Roman wrestling as well. So I did all of those and, you know, until I was about 15. And then as soon as I got introduced to marijuana, it was over. I went to music, you know? So, it's, you know, and then I started like reading Led Zeppelin biographies and, you know, I'm like, all of a sudden that really appealed to me, right? Destroying a hotel room and doing a bunch of drugs and drinking. I was like, this sounds like fun. So it very much changed my identity, right? So I started identifying myself as that type of person, you know, and by the time I was in my 20s, I was doing daily drinking for sure. You know, that's when it started really shifting on me, right? Initially before that, I believed that alcohol was like bridging this gap between like who I wanted to be. I was a really shy kid, so this was allowing me to go to house parties and actually be social and be like more certain of myself and, you know, come out of my shell, quote unquote, and talk to the girls that I had a crush on. Right. So initially I thought, I was like, man, this is the real me. And this is helping the real me come out. You know, by the time I was 20s though, it started getting a lot darker. You know what I mean? I was crossing lines. I was drinking in the morning. I was drinking, just all these different like rules I'd put in place for myself. I was just completely just forgetting about them, you know, like no drinks till 6. All of a sudden I'm drinking as soon as I got home from work. No drinks on the, you know, in the afternoon. On the weekends, I'd start drinking at noon and be like, it's not so bad. I can handle this. Right. So the whole idea is like, you know, I was leveling up with everything in my life. I was still getting promoted at work. My band was doing well. And so I had this like comparison of like, well, I'm not that guy that's behind the store that's got the brown paper bag, you know, the usual comparison, the stereotype alcoholic, that, I'm judging by saying that. Right. And just going, I'm not that guy. Like I'm still doing well and I'm young. You know, I can handle this. You know, 27, I put myself in the hospital for acute pancreatitis from a really like rough party weekend. And so I was in the hospital for 3 days and I was just doing the whole, like, you know, praying, like, if I get out of here, I've learned my lesson, you know? And I'll tell you, man, this is how strong my brain is as far as like the addiction and such goes. As soon as I got released out of the hospital after 3 days, I'm walking home from the hospital. I passed about 3 different liquor stores. The first one, I was like, okay, yeah, that's the old me. The second one, by that time, my brain is negotiating with me going, you know what? Rye that did that to you. Like, you can start drinking beer. Like beer, you can moderate it. Like nobody has problems drinking beer. You can be a beer drinker. I'm like, yeah, I don't know, man. I just got out of the hospital. And then by the third liquor store, I'm like, I think I can drink beer. I think you're right, brain. And then I grabbed a 6-pack and then I was like a beer drinker, you know, for the next couple of years. Finally, when I was 30-ish to 31, somewhere in there, I just hit like a rock bottom. It was curiously enough though, still everything was leveling up for me, but I just could not get my shit together otherwise. And, I finally put my hand up and I said, I need to take some time off work. You know, I thought I was going to get fired and disowned by my family for admitting that I had this problem. And it was like the opposite, man. Like my family rallied around me. My work was super gentle and you know, cared for me. And it's like, yeah, take whatever time you need off. And so I took 5 weeks. You know, the first 2 weeks of the 5 weeks, I went on this massive bender to try and get it out of my system, quote unquote. And finally I was like, okay, I got to go one way or the other here. I'm either just going to keep doing this, like just go on the binge and all binges, or I'm going to at least try this recovery thing, you know? And a buddy of mine took me to my first AA meeting, and that was like literally saved my life, man. Like we went in there and I had this like feeling. I don't think I've ever I've had something close, and I'll get to that. By the time it like literally felt like there was somebody that had been sitting on my shoulders that just like gone off of me, and I started tearing up. I don't even remember what the guy said, but it was just like profound, like spiritual 180 shift inside me. I was like, okay. And on the strength of that, I kept going to AA meetings for daily or every other day, or sometimes a few times a day, depending on when I could make it, for the next 8 months, and just completely changed my whole life. Started getting into self-development, like Wayne Dyer audiobooks, different things like that, journaling, and just really redefining like everything that I used to do drunk. I would to like go camping, like music again, all these different things, and just really redefining what life was to me for the next 3 years. And then I had this idea, my ego gradually, I think, was really sneaking its way back in, over those 3 years. And I stopped doing some of the things that were keeping me grounded and sober. And, eventually I relapsed, and under the guise that like, I'm cured, I got this, I'm like the three worst things that three worst words that I could have said to myself is I got this. And, the next 3+ years, I tried all the most ridiculous moderation techniques you could possibly think of. Some that would be viewed as logical. None of them worked for me. Right. It's just, all roads led back to me just binge drinking, or, you know what I mean? So it was tricky, man. The moderation.
And at what point in your recovery did you relapse? How long did you have before you relapsed?
So it was a little over 3 years. It was like 3 years and 3 months. Yeah. So it was a good stint in there. And, yeah.
And
so
what do you think you stopped? What were the things that you were doing that were the foundational pieces that you stopped that caused you to relapse at that point?
Yeah. Really good question. So the one thing was like the community part. By that point, I'd all but stopped going to AA meetings. And I, like I said, when we talk about the ego specifically, I started viewing myself a little more self-important, right? Like I wasn't as open. I wasn't as selfless. Like I wasn't as, I think as soon as I got out of that whole like recovery community where there's like the giver's gain, I go in there to like support other people, and that in turn helps me. As soon as I removed that element from the way I was living my life and started putting myself forward again, because, everything was going great, for me. I got promoted again, all these great things. So I think over time I started believing my own shit again. You know what I mean? And it was a gradual thing. I think that was the number one thing, man, was just like, I removed myself from, I took my foot out of that recovery realm. And I just went back out in the world, the wild, if you will. And that's what led me down the path where I was like, I'm good. It was 3 years. I'm like, clearly I'm wiser now, and I've got all these tools, and I'll be able to do this, so it was definitely, if that answers the question.
Yeah. And I always ask people that relapsed after a significant amount of time, what changed. Yeah. And it seems like the answer always kind of circles around the same thing. Right. And it's not necessarily like, because I don't personally promote any specific fellowship. I've never told anybody what fellowships I'm a part of or if I am. But I think that in any of the 12-step fellowships, the 12th step, if you actually do the steps, is about carrying the message to other alcoholics, to other addicts, and doing it in a way where you're practicing these principles in all of your affairs. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that it's possible for someone that built the foundation in the 12-step fellowships, right? That really strengthens their character, that really strengthens their spiritual principled living. I think it's possible for them to take what they learn and go apply that in life if they're going out and helping the people get out of the place that they used to be, right? I haven't seen a whole lot of successful people stay recovered forever if they get out of the fellowship to go, work on success in the world,
Right. Yeah.
But people that go out and they keep helping people, that's a huge component. And I believe that that's what the number one relapse is purpose in helping addicts and alcoholics find recovery.
Yeah, that's a great point, man. I'm really glad that you brought that up. I haven't had that reflected back to me quite like the way you articulated it there. So yeah, absolutely, man. For 100%. Yeah. So I think it just, with the way I answered the question and the way you summarized it after, very much, cohesive in that manner. And yeah, it's like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with like the whole, like the hero's journey. It's like the Joseph Campbell idea. Where you're like, you go through the dark night of it's like the threshold where you like realize that your life can no longer be the same. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is like, you go through the dark night of your soul. You do all this inner realizations about yourself and do all this inner work. And then component 3 of the hero's journey is exactly what you're talking about, where you're just like, you go back with all that you've learned and then you help somebody go through their own hero's journey. And then it just keeps perpetuating itself. So
100%.
I very much
And
see it
what
like
better
that.
community,
Right?
There literally is no other community on the planet where someone that finds recovery has, just in the United States, 22 million people right now suffering, are a pool of people that need you out there listening. Yeah. And you're in Canada. Have you looked at the numbers there for how many people are suffering?
Yeah, I did this actually. I'm a part of a BNI business networking group, and I did a small presentation on it. I want to say it was like 50. What was it now? You know what? I might be remembering it incorrectly. I don't want to say a number and it being wrong. I can't remember it off the top of my head. I want to say it was like 50 million, but yeah, don't quote me. Yeah, it was like it's
wherever you're at in the world, there's plenty of us.
Yeah, exactly. Needless to say, there's a lot. Yeah, 100% for sure. Yeah.
So you come back into recovery. You have this relapse, and you had another. Did you have another rock bottom? What happened to cause you to have that new kind of hero's journey stage 2?
Yeah, dude. Yeah. So it was actually my dad. He passed away a couple days before Christmas, 2018. So he had retired. He had been a fireman in Prince George, where I grew up, for 35 years. And this is my perception of it. He lost his identity in a lot of ways. You see this with people that are like, especially like he was a hero, you know what I mean? Like a fireman. Yeah. And then, a year into his retirement, his drinking just went uptick huge. He started smoking cigarettes again. He wasn't taking care of himself as well as he could have, and he passed away. And, like my Uncle Paul, the other guy I was telling you about in the beginning of my story there, I mean, he passed away from complications from drinking a few years before that even. So I'm seeing these two guys that, from the 5-year-old version of me that I was telling you that story at the beginning, both those guys are gone now. And I'm 37, at that stage in time. And I'm like, oh man, okay, I'm on this same path here. Right. So, that was a big, it was kind of, you get the taps on the shoulder from the universe. That was like one of those big smack in the back of the head. And I'd love to say that sobered me up right away. It didn't. I continued, and part of it was the justification. Oh, I just lost my dad. Right. I get to, I get to continue drinking here. So it was actually on my way out to his celebration of life. So this was April of 2019. And this is like perfect timing for all of this, like perfect storm, if you will. So I came out of a really rough, it was the beginning of my holidays, and I was going to leave that Monday of the holidays to go pay respects to my dad. So beginning of holidays, of course, I went out with some friends, and, it turned out to be this huge, like binge weekend, like cocaine, alcohols. I was smoking cigarettes again. I hadn't smoked in years. Right. And I was driving out to go pay respects to my dad. It's about an 8-hour drive. And I was so strung out and just like, what am I doing with my life? Right. Just suicidal ideation. Like, I'm just like, and it was one of these like profound moments where I was about halfway home. So Edmonton, and then Prince George is about 8 hours west, and right in the middle is a beautiful Rocky Mountain town called Jasper. And that's like my dad and I met there quite a few times, because it was like the halfway point between where we lived. And so we spent some time there, and it's just a beautiful spot. Right. And I was driving through there feeling empty, like feeling nothing. It was a beautiful sunny day. And I'm just like, what is wrong with me? And I remember picking up my phone and just trying to get some of that energy moving, some of that stagnant energy moving. And I was just saying some pretty dark stuff. And I'll tell you, just that energy exchange, there was another one of those moments that was similar to that first AA meeting, where there was like a shift inside of me. And I believed I said right then and there, I'm like, I'm going to do this for you, Dad. Like, this is going to be a living tribute to you. Cause there's a lineage of alcoholism on his side of the family. Like his dad, his dad's dad, like Irish descent, right? Just very stoic. Yeah. Big time drinkers, right? So throughout the generations, and I'm like, it's going to stop with me, and and as a tribute to you, Dad, right? And then that was it. So April 8th, 2019, and yeah, I've been sober since.
Amen.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Let's go. And in your recovery now, because that's 4 years coming up next month.
That's right. Yeah.
Let's go.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, man.
What are you doing different this time? Compared to last time? Because you've already made it a little bit longer than you did last time. What are you doing differently?
Right. Great question. Yeah. So this one is like, it's interesting because like somebody asked me that a while ago, and I was like, hadn't really thought of this actually, right? So I'll sum it up like this. So like the first time I was a little bit out of balance. And I imagine you can relate to this, and some of your listeners can relate to this. I was very like, there's like the yin activities, the yang. I was so yang, right? I was so like doer, achiever, fixer, like I'm just action based. So I still had this part of me that had this like idea of like I needed to like let off some steam. And that's I never found something that would satiate that when I was sober that first time. And I'd try like again, I was like trying different sports again. I was trying more loud yang activities, and like if I could go work out harder, that's gonna like burn off that need to feel reckless, and it never did, right? And it's like I get angry and it's like and I'm still like, no, I need something else, like this isn't working, right? And this time around, curiously enough, it's been the more yin activities, so like breath work, meditation, journaling, what else, like yin yoga, even like stretching, that kind of stuff, changing the music that I listen to instead of this angry, I still love, like Rage Against the Machine and bands like that I grew up on, more so for the nostalgic elements. I mean, like you're saying, like with the rock music at the beginning, I love that rock music, right? But I also like just classical music, more like meditation, sound therapy music, which is what I've, calibrated my musical compositions to these days. So that was the big difference, man. And it seems counterintuitive because it's like the more relaxed kind of like mellow Zen side of me that I just had not cultivated before. And by cultivating that need for recklessness and like, let's go, let's like burn off some steam, just melted away. So I was going the opposite approach. I was just going so heavy on the yang and the achievement and the blah, and then this and the sports and then workouts and all that, which is all great. I had nothing as far as, the other side of things, the yin side, if you will. So that has been like a massive game changer. Plus the fact I think I'm just a little bit older and wiser and a little more mellow to begin with. You know what I mean? So I'm sure that's helped as well.
Yeah. And something that, that I really relate to is, that achieving mentality. Like I've got to get this done and this done and this done and this done. And something that has really, really helped me stay steadfast in recovery is all of that yin work that you're talking about is the first thing I do. First thing I do in the morning. Like first thing I do in the morning. Well, I just shifted up my my morning routine this morning, but prior to that, I would first thing in the morning, I would just turn on worship music, just so the first thing I'm hearing is about God and about his love for me, and just hearing that, and then start petting the puppy and stuff like that. And then get to journaling and Bible reading and spiritual work, and then feeding my dog, taking my dog for a walk, doing that stuff. And what I've found is that puts me in a place to bring the yin into my yang activities, right? Because then for the rest of the day, I am like right here and I'm working with this person and talking to this person. Like how can I make this happen? How can I make this happen? Having all these different conversations and being able to bring that in has helped me a lot, because that's something that I had at very early recovery. Was every single morning the first thing that I'm doing is connecting spiritually in some way. And sometimes that meant that I was going to the gym, and then at the gym I'm listening to worship music. That's my thing. I love worship music just because it starts putting that stuff into my mind immediately. And of course, I have some Rage Against the Machine days also, like where it's just like, because that can be a yin activity too. If you're just sitting here like, killing in the name of, like acting like you're playing Guitar Hero, dude. I used to love that,
I love it. I love it. Yeah, that's great stuff. So it sounds like you definitely relate to that. Thanks for sharing that. Man, I love it too. Like that's a big thing that I mentioned now is like the mornings used to be my least favorite time for obvious reasons. I'd wake up all, hungover and just like, oh man, 2 hours sleep, quote unquote, as in I passed out somewhere, and now I love mornings, man. I just love them. I feel so creative. I feel like so, like you say, more, I'm at my spiritual height, my creative height, just my compassionate height, just like the whole, dude, I love mornings.
Yeah. And your mind is operating at 10.5 wave cycles per second in the first 25 minutes of when you become conscious. So if you're out there, when you're listening right now, I know that you've heard this in the past, I know that you've heard something like this in the past, but as soon as you wake up, that doesn't mean when you get out of bed. Because if when you wake up, you grab your phone and you start scrolling through Facebook, unless you find this podcast and you're listening to this right now, then you'll start getting some good stuff in your mind. But in the first 25 minutes, everything that you let get into your mind is going to go through your day. So if you immediately start checking emails and messages, your day is going to be comprised of worrying about other people's worries. Oof. And if the first thing that you do when you wake up is you start implanting your head with, purpose, with relationship with God, with goals, and with things that, are good for you, that personal development type stuff, then everything that you take care of that day is going to be at the best place you can possibly be. And a lot of people, that's another thing that, when we were talking earlier about, helping people that are out there needing it, and working that 12th step. You can't work your best 12th step unless you are first the best you. You have to take care of yourself and develop yourself in a way where you can attract people into recovery. That's the whole point. So it's not selfish to take care of yourself first. That's actually becoming the person that can be absolutely selfless. And guys, we're going to take, because we're about to get into stories, because I actually have 4 written down right now from your story that I want to ask you about. Yeah. We're going to take a quick 60-second break because I have an announcement. Some of you have heard it, but we are this close to this, so we will see you in just a moment. What's up, family? I have an exciting announcement for you. This year, we will be doing monthly launches of our courses that will bring you into weekly coaching with me and weekly one-on coaching with a certified Recovered on Purpose coach to train you exactly how to get your story out to more people and help addicts get clean. And guess what? We will have 100% scholarships available for those that are in need of financial support. At the end of the first 30-day course, you'll be upgraded to weekly group coaching with myself and other coaches and given the opportunity to get certified to be a Recovered on Purpose coach as well. There will be all kinds of perks to being in the community, and after 90 days, you will be eligible to work with Recovered on Purpose, sharing your story in your local community and being paid hourly plus daily bonuses. Imagine having a part-time job in your recovery where your job is sharing your recovery story in the community movement we have at Recovered on Purpose with the public, decked out in fresh Recovered on Purpose gear and out there helping your community with your story. None of this is possible without all of you helping spread the message and our donors and sponsors supporting this mission. I want to thank all our bronze, silver, and gold donors with a special thank you to our platinum level sponsor, the King's Brotherhood, where the most elite businessmen come to grow and ascend to the next level in their business. If you're interested in giving to this cause or becoming a sponsor of this cause, visit recoveredonpurpose.com/donation. Enjoy the rest of the show and keep living Recovered on Purpose. Amen. Amen. Super excited about that, guys. I have had hundreds of calls with addicts in recovery, bro. Hundreds of calls. And, I started this company to make this type of education, to make personal development and mindset and, higher level of education available to everyone. And, before we were able to be nonprofit, I had to sell coaching and sell courses and things like that to make this sustainable. And bro, I want to serve this community, and we became 501c3 at the end of last year. And we are really, really close right now to some very major partnerships that are going to make it so that we can serve this community full on. Everybody listening to this right now is going to have access to these courses and coaching. So super excited about it, guys. Awesome. So Matt, first story I want to ask you about. Your uncle and your parents gave you alcohol at 5 or 6 years old. Has that story changed or developed in your head? And what were you originally telling yourself about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like rolling back the clocks to the beginning. Before we do though, man, I got to say, amazing stuff you have going on. That commercial was just so smooth and exciting. I didn't want to continue on until I actually, seriously, man, give you some props. Like, amazing work you're doing. And super exciting. And dude, just really happy to be a part of this show. I'm like, holy, you're like next level, man. So
I
awesome,
really
awesome
appreciate you,
stuff.
brother.
Really want to give you
Really
props
appreciate it.
there.
Thank you.
Yeah. So like, as far as like what I was telling it about myself,
And actually, before we answer that,
yeah.
Tell the audience what exactly a story is that we're talking about right now. Like, what is the definition of this kind of story?
Yeah, absolutely. So a story for me can show up in a lot of different ways. So a story, when I think of a story, it's like I can tell myself a story in order to keep myself in a spot of stuck, permission to be, in a victim story, for example. That's a big one, right? So
Yeah.
it's the difference between admitting that I have been perhaps victimized and also then adapting like a victim mentality where it's an intentional choice to stay in that victim story, right? So there's a distinction. I hope I'm articulating that.
Yeah.
There's also, stories to help me cope with something. There's stories to help me let people, there can be like stories of forgiveness. There can be like stories that end up being somewhat nefarious or that contribute to like limiting beliefs in myself. And there can be stories that grandize other people. You know what I mean? It's like, there's an objective truth. And then there's a story that I attach to that objective truth that'll amplify certain aspects that will either be there to protect myself from whether it's a limiting or a victim story, or something that like I triumphed past, you know what I mean? So it's, it's a loaded idea, right? But I hope that gets the idea. And you mentioned like the quote at the beginning, the Carl Jung, it's, change your story, change your life. And there's like a Stoic quote, I'm paraphrasing. It's not what happens to you. It's the story about what happens to you that really has like that charge, right? So,
100%.
so that's what I'm talking about as far as stories.
Yeah. And what we talk about here, and guys, when we're talking about sharing our stories here, obviously we're talking about sharing our recovery stories and sharing the story that we went through, our recovery story and all that. What we're talking about here is kind of the story that we tell ourselves that creates an identity within ourselves, right? So something like an example from my life, in my addiction, right? I was always trying to do this personal development stuff. Like I graduated from Landmark Worldwide's Curriculum for Living. I was part of the Introduction Leaders program. They gave me a Up to the Biggest Thing award in front of 450 people at this event in New York. And I left that event and went and used heroin. And what this told me through my addiction, when I would set a goal and I'm doing this at 3:00, right? And then at 2:30, I don't have dope. So I have to go get dope until I have dope. I can't do this until I have dope. I became someone in my head that can't complete anything. I can't trust myself with goals I set. And that's the story that came from all that stuff that I was doing. So when we're talking about these stories, think about things that have happened in your life, maybe that you relate to with Matt's story, and what you're telling yourself about yourself based on that event. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. As far as the that initial one, so there's and this is a good, there's a spectrum that I could be on here, right? So there could be like the blame, right? And I never felt that, right? But there could have been like, oh, I was 5 years old, I didn't know any better. There was none of that. In fact, I look at it as, I don't want to say with like some humor, because it's not really not funny either. So, but somewhere in there, right? So I definitely don't view it as like this, this like defining story that's something that I'm like still angry about or that I can point the finger at. I never felt particularly victimized. I mean, I know a lot of, people that I grew up with that had similar stories or were allowed to have drinks when they were 10 or 11 or, things of that nature. So I look at it as, and I just, my dad and my uncle, when they were, probably didn't remember doing it, or if they did, it seemed harmless enough. It was a sip of beer at the time, so that one for me, I don't, other than just like looking back on it as like, oh, there's something there. And this is like the work that I've been doing the last few years to go, it's like you start, it's a journey for me, like back to where it all started. And that's about as far back a memory as I can recall, as far as like being introduced to alcohol and just like how normalized it was. So if
But
anything,
it wasn't like a defining, like, oh, I was 5 years old and an alcoholic now. I drink every
oh,
day.
it was definitely like the concept of like the normalization of it. I was like, oh,
Got it. Yep.
more so that big picture that I can
Yep.
look at back. But yeah, certainly not like a victim story or like I didn't know any better. There's none of that. Like that charge is I don't think ever was there. And if it was, it's certainly gone now.
Yeah. Okay. So, and part of the reason why I asked that also is part of my story. I was straight A student. I was home run derby hitter at the Little League World Series and state champion wrestler in Little League and all kinds of stuff like that. And was introduced to cocaine at 12 years old by a 21, 22-year-old person that was very close. And when I remembered that, because I didn't remember it through my addiction at all, but in my recovery at one point, all of a sudden it all came up for me. And I started blaming that person in my recovery. I'm 2-3 years sober and start blaming this person in my head for ruining my life. But how would you start working with someone that had a story like that in their head? How would you start working that?
That's great. Yeah. And so the idea of like story work is basically this. So I'll give a Cole's Notes version of it. So you have that story, you come to me with it, and it's got some charge to it. You still got this like idea, okay, that you've been victimized. And that's the idea. I'll have the distinction of okay, there's victim mentality and you've been victimized. So and the opposite of being a victim is there's accountability. So yes, we are acknowledging this happened to you. Not necessarily that person isn't necessarily off the hook right now, especially in the state that you're in. There is some allowance of like, you're allowed to be angry at this person, right? And you're allowed to be feeling any feeling that you're feeling. Yeah. So what we do is the whole idea is like you type it up or you write it out. If we're in person, I know you're a big pen to paper guy. We talked about that before. So if we're doing it in person, I get you to write that story out. So as if you're writing part of your autobiography. Okay. And you title it as if it were the chapter, whatever the guy's name is, or 12 years old, or something that cues you and gets you into that state of mind. Yep. So you write it all out, just brain dump whatever that story is. And that's step one. And then I check in with you, I go, Adam, like, how does that show up in your body? There's a good chance it'll have activated some strong emotion. You might have been like pretty tense when you were writing. So you articulate that. We get you thinking about how it's showing up in your body though, right? It's not just like a mental thing. A lot of people I find bypass and they try and like explain something and they just sort of bypass how it's showing up in the body. So it's very important. And that's where the breathing comes in. Very important.
And why is it important for the body to understand that?
So for me, it's like, for me, recovery is a body, mind, spirit thing, right? Yeah. So if you have any of those elements are being eliminated or negated, it's going to be very challenging for you to continue on. And a lot of people I find live from the head up, right? So they're in their head a lot of the time and not paying attention to what their body is telling them. There's a really good phrase that the body remembers what the mind forgets. So whether it's trauma, whether it's like something that, your body's telling you something, and if you don't have that coordination to be able to tell what's happening in your body and being able to articulate it because you're just negating what's showing up in your body or numbing it, that can become a problem. And that can show up in, diseases, that can show up in many other different, different things. So it's important to have that connection of the body and the mind. And I believe that the breath is breath is like a spirit in a lot of ways, your life energy and connecting the two. Right. So great question though. I'm glad you stopped me there.
Yeah. And then what I did with that, just to make it clear for everybody, I went back through that story and I was young, right? I was young and there isn't really an excuse on that person, but I was also like really, really attached to the hip to this person. Really, really like asking him to do this with him and asking him to do this with him and asking him to do this with him. And you hit the nail on the head with the accountability part. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you're 12 or 30. I still made the choice.
Right.
I still made the choice. And after that happened, right, it was within, a month or two, maybe 3 months after that, where he wasn't in my life for a long period of time. And during that whole period, I continued making the same choice. So here I am. How could I possibly remember that first instance when I could have learned alcohol or drugs anywhere, and I would have had the
Right.
same thing happen. So
Interesting.
that's
Yeah,
how I
yeah.
work. That's how I work through that.
Yeah, definitely. I like that. I like that. Yeah, and that's what it is like the accountability part initially seems like it'd be fairly disarming. It's like realizing that no, you made that choice, and some people might not want to hear that depending on where they are in their recovery. It's kind of like getting like bopped in the nose a bit, right? It's like a
Yeah.
projection. Like if you've been used to blaming other people, it's this learned helplessness, right? You're blaming life circumstances. You're blaming that other person. It's safe. It's like taking the heat off yourself. But as soon as you point that finger back at yourself, there is that initial like, perhaps denial or like rejection of it. But dude, after that, it's like super empowering, right?
Yes.
And that's where you
100%.
stop that victim mentality. Instead of having that victimization echo through the whole rest of your life, you've made a conscious decision to stop it. And then it's empowering. And then all of a sudden you can start working with that again, can't you?
Yeah, 100%. And I was just having this big conversation on my page about the difference between complaining and doing the work. Someone like you can't become a man, you can't become a responsible woman if you're complaining about things all the time, because what complaining is taking on that victim mentality.
Yeah.
Like it's that person's fault. I can't do this because of this, because of this.
Mm-hmm.
Doing the work is talking to somebody and talking through it to gain your own responsibility for what happens from here on.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yeah, 100%, man. Very well put. I love that summary. Yeah, that's great stuff. If I just want to go back to the final steps of the story work, because I liked your add on with it. But so, for example, we have you write it out. I check in with you. How did that feel to write out? We do a body scan. What is it mentally? Were you getting some like inner dialogue chatter? And just documenting it all. There's no wrong answer. Everything's right. So just we write it all down. I get you to read it out loud. And then it's going to have a whole different charge when you read it out loud, right? And you're getting it out of your head. Now you're reading it. We do the same thing. You read it, I check in with you. Second read that you do it. So step 3, you read it at about 70% speed. What that does is if there's secondary emotions, like often there's anger underneath, there's hurt, right? So similar idea. Having said that as well, if there's like a triggering sentence, most people will read over that very quickly, very nimbly, just trying to jump over it, right? Whereas if you have to read it very deliberately at 70%, all of a sudden it has this opportunity to have another secondary emotion come up, and then we can check in again. From there can often be a different perspective, a perspective shift, self-forgiveness, perhaps at least the option of forgiving the other person, right? And then by the last time, what we do is like literally each sentence, we break the story into each sentence, and between each sentence, you take a nice big breath in and out. And then by the end of it, it's like we literally say you've aired out your story now, right? So by the end, you got the brain chemistry going on from these big, deep breaths. You've had more than enough time to like think about it. You read the sentence, you breathe on it. Any self-doubt, inner dialogue is going to come up at that point, or there's going to be the opposite of like, you know what? I have been thinking about this wrong. So there's all this space to like form a different perspective on your story. And then by the end, the real magic happens is where you take like, if there is a statement of negation of like, I can't get over this, right? We'll focus in on that. We'll take out the I can't, or be like, okay, if you can't get over this, what can you do? And then we take that story or take that statement of negation, turn it to an affirmation. And that's what you're going to use. Anytime that this story does start coming back up, if you're getting that like body reaction to it, say this affirmation, breathe on it afterwards. And dude, it takes the whole story takes on a whole different form at that point. It's a very powerful coaching modality.
I love it. Yeah. And it's similar to what I mean, it's a totally different type of work because you're actually going into like the perspective and looking at what this story means. Yeah. And for instance, what I do is we share something called the opening heart shock story. Where like the turning point when we realized we were no longer drinking and using for fun, but we were deciding to drink and use to cope with life. We were becoming an addict or alcoholic consciously. And
yes.
Sometimes those stories are like the most painful stories because something happened in our life that caused us to need drugs and alcohol consciously, right? And for instance, my best friend killed himself after I hung up on him. Yeah. And I couldn't tell anybody that story for almost 10 years And then as soon as I started telling that story, the story stopped having power over me. When I started telling the truth about what happened, I told it to this person kind of in a whisper. Then I told it to this person, you know, a little bit louder, more confident. Then this person, and then my self-blame went away. And then, dude, now it's the opening of my keynote speech, or the opening of, you know, podcasts. If you guys haven't listened to it yet, check the show notes for our last podcast. But every podcast I get on, it's now my power story. Right. So if you're struggling with something right now that has one of these stories in your head, right, that can become your power story to help other people. The amount of people that have messaged me and told me, you know, I heard that story about your friend Chuck, and, you know, I went through a similar thing. You know, I went through the same thing. I haven't told anybody about this, you know, or I'm thinking about suicide right now. Right. So it becomes this portal to helping others. And one thing that I don't think the 12 steps got wrong, but I think people interpret it wrong. In the 4th step, when it says my part, right? When you have to figure out what your part in something is. And there was nothing in my life that I can't obviously see my part in. I wasn't abused as a child. I wasn't, you know, I didn't have that kind of stuff happen to me. And when someone, let's say, was molested as a kid, right? How do you do work around that to help them understand their part in it now, without telling them that it is something that is their fault, right? Because I think that's what a lot of people think my part means.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a loaded question for sure. And it gets back to the whole, what is it within your control now, right? And and that's what we're not suggesting that didn't happen to you, or, you know, and it's funny you mentioned this, or curious you mentioned this, because I did this story workshop at a sober house about a week ago, and there was a gal in there that was not ready to hear that. Hey, like, she's it must have, I'm imagining it, something happened to her traumatic fairly recently, so she wasn't quite ready to hear that it's not your story, it's not the life event, it's the story about the life event. She was not digging that. I said, you know what, that's totally cool. Like, if we got to respect that everybody's at different stages of it, right? So but the idea is, like, if I get somebody that's ready to do the healing, and we can address it as, yes, that has happened to you, and, you know, let's respect that you know, life event, but let's also look at what you can do coming out of it. What have you been doing, and what can we tweak, and what can we do to take your power back? And from there, you know, work backwards. And if we get to that stage where we can actually unpack the actual story of it happening, you know, it'll be whatever is able to happen from, if, you know, when you air out the story, it's not necessarily going to make sure that the other person is forgiven, but there might be a little bit more of an understanding, and there won't be just that real tense, you know, something in the body that's just been like, and like you say, from there, that's a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. So if we can alleviate some of that, I mean, that's a huge win, right? And then the main thing is, like, the responsibility. Okay, what are you doing with your own life now? What choices have you made coming out of that you can, you know what I mean, that you can adjust? And that's going to really take your power back. And from there, I believe that self-forgiveness and that guilt and the shame will melt away. And then whatever happens with that other person, whether you can forgive or forget, I mean, you know, that's a whole other thing. But we're talking about, like, what can you do in the present moment? And that would be how I would go about it, for sure.
And how important do you think it is for someone to learn how to forgive?
Oh, dude,
even those super traumatic thits that happen to you by somebody.
Yeah, man. I mean, I'm like you, like, same thing. I wasn't, you know, molested or some of these things. So it's might sound easy for me to say. But, you know, it's like that self-forgiveness is massive. And from there, I believe as soon as you practice that, I believe that there's going to be some room, or at least you can be curious about forgiving that other person, right? And remember, it's like the forgiveness in the sense that, like, you're forgiving them for your own self-care. You know what I mean? You don't even have to go up to them and go, hey, I forgive you for that. Cause that might
100%.
right.
Yes.
But just the fact that you can sever that tie of that connection that you have with them by forgiving them, if that makes sense. Yep. I mean, geez. And then that's just so incredibly powerful. So, to answer your question, it's forgiveness is huge, dude. It's like, it's one of my pillars of my own personal recovery is forgiveness, and that's self-forgiveness, and that's forgiveness of others. That I've had the story that they've done something wrong to me, right? And they probably had no idea that they did, and it really isn't about me. You know what I mean? So alleviating all those ties, those external ties, to yourself, and it's just, dude, it's so huge. That would be like, my Mount Rushmore of traits for successful recovery, for sure.
Yeah. And I think, inner dialogue about forgiveness that people have to be very clear on is when you say, I forgive you, it does not mean it's okay.
Right.
It does not mean it's okay when you forgive somebody. And like you were saying earlier, 100%, like I've done a lot of work with a lot of people that have been through a lot of things. And the most powerful place that I get to with people when I'm working with them is when they find God, period, point blank. When somebody has an experience right in front of me where they understand that God is with them for the first time in their life, right? And then number 2 is when they actually release / forgive something that happened in their past that they're no longer going to take it into their future. And you can actually see that break, because it is how you take your power back. If you were abused as a kid at 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, and you're 28 now, and that person that did that to you at 5, 6, 7, 8 is still controlling you at this point in life, and they're wherever they are, that's not fair to you.
Right.
It doesn't hurt them anymore for you to think about it. Right.
Yeah.
And I know it's a hard conversation to have, because if I had my way, every child abuser would be castrated and thrown into solitary confinement. If I had it my way. And no, I wouldn't do death penalty, because it would be worse than solitary confinement.
Right.
All right, let's get past that.
Yeah. Right.
So what are some stories that you have personally worked on in your life, in your recovery, and overcame them? And how did that change your perspective on life?
Yeah, some great questions. It's like the first ones I wanted to work on, and it's the most important for me, was figuring out why I had this addictive behavior in the first place. Right. So the first time I had sobered up, as you had mentioned, I got the beer out of my hand. I started going to the gym, and that was great. But I was delving into some self-development, but I never got far enough that it was sustained. It wasn't sustainable. Right. So that was a big part of this now, is just like getting very curious about, why I was drinking in the first place. So that was where I started. A lot of the, for story work, it's like something that annoys you, something that's hurt you, or something that haunts you. So I went right for like the haunted stories, the ones that like still, and again, we're talking about the body mind, relation. It's like the ones that, like, when I'm meditating or something, and it's like a feeling of embarrassment, or a feeling of, something I do need to forgive with somebody else, or even myself. And it jolts me. If it has that like jolt to it, and it still bugs me, and has that like response, that body response, then I will investigate it. So for me, it was, there was a degree of like some bullying when I was younger. There was, when my parents got divorced. So some of the blame I put on myself for that. Right. Early drinking stories too, where I was like, just curious about like, why did I do this? So I typed them up and do the whole story work process on it. There was a relationship story. So my wife, right now, we've been together 16 years, and we had a falling out that, we were the party couple, right? And now we've sobered up together, which is amazing. So those stories, just getting through all of that and being able to objectively look at them differently, There isn't the charge anymore on them. And honestly, dude, the biggest thing that I'm working on now, and it's a work in progress, and I believe it will be for a while, is just getting into the pattern that I took on after I stopped drinking. So that was an achiever, very much an achiever pattern. It sounds like like you relate to that. It's just my self-worth is tied up with what I'm doing and how much I'm doing and how quickly I'm doing it. And so if I can show up on, your show and be like, hey, I got all this stuff going on, then it's like, then I can feel good about myself. Right. Versus just showing up and just be like, I'm enough. And it's all cool. I still have a degree of like nerves and anxiety around who I am as a person. And I believe that's, 20 years of drinking heavily. I didn't develop certain parts of my personality, and I'm doing my best to develop them very quickly now. But yeah, dude, that's the biggest one. So for me, it was like getting, I think what they call in AA, like emotional sobriety. So getting to the idea where all emotions are great. There isn't a hierarchy of good and bad emotions. The bad emotions that I used to achieve or achieve my, finding a different way to numb them. And that's usually by achieving or like putting myself in a stress state of like, I got to get all this stuff done. You know what I mean? Which is doing the same thing that the drinking was in a lot of ways. It's like, I get into a stress state. I'm numbing out my feelings. I'm like, I don't have time to feel lonely right now because I'm busy doing this. Right. So that's what I'm working on these days. And it's definitely a work in progress. It feels uncomfortable to be working on something, and I can feel some of these feelings coming up. And normally I'd be like, no, okay, I'm just going to check my email. No, and now I'm like, okay, I put my hands on my table, take a big breath in. I allow whatever's coming up. If that's sadness, if that's loneliness, I ask, I even ask myself, like, what are you trying to tell me? I'll do some journaling. I'll do the opposite of what I used to do with this kind of thing, right? Instead of just, okay, one more email, I'm going to go on Instagram now. I will intentionally put myself in a spot where I feel uncomfortable and figure out what that is, whether that's like the inner child or the inner teenager. I started drinking when I was a teenager, so I think there's some unresolved stuff there. And if that comes up in story work, then that's great. So it's just a continual work in progress.
Amen. Yeah, thank you very much for being here, brother. And before we go, guys, we're about to talk about Matt's his results from an exercise that we did on his podcast, and I actually shared that exercise on his podcast for the first time on a podcast. I do it with he dipped out for a second. I think he was having technical difficulties. But I will have him come in and do a video sometime and tell you guys what his results were. But if you want to know what the exercise is, go listen to the podcast in the show notes that I did with him. The exercise is awesome. I do it with people in my course. I do it myself. I did it myself recently within the last couple of weeks, just to recenter on, what really drives me. And it takes, maybe 10 minutes tops to do the whole thing. And bring him back in. You hooked back up?
I did. Yeah. I apologize. I'm trying to get the camera going and everything just cut out on me there.
You're good. Your camera's been off for a few minutes, but we can go over the results.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, guys, do this exercise. Everybody that I've done this exercise with has gotten some really key insights into themselves and what really drives them. So, Matt, what did you get from doing this exercise? What did you learn?
Yeah, right. Do we have to kind of briefly go over what the exercise, or will the listeners know which one you're talking about?
I'm going to let them kind of listen to the podcast to find the exercise. We have like a minute and a half left here.
Beautiful. Sounds good. So the 3 drivers that I came up with that I want to experience in the next year. It's like I put down, I love life. I am patient. I am present.
Awesome. And what were the top 3 that you had to cross out that surprised you?
Yeah, those are good, right? I feel an ambience of joy, which I thought was fairly similar to I love life. I act confidently, even in fear. So that was a good one.
Ooh, you
Right.
crossed that out. Name the three again.
So I am
You're
patient,
peaceful, patient.
patient, present, and love life.
Amen.
Yeah.
That's
So
interesting. That's interesting. So
yes.
that's you are more driven to feel that way than to walk confidently. So
So
what you'll
my
find is
yeah.
that having those three things will cause you to walk confidently.
That's why it was like the last to cross out. I'm thinking that it's going to be a byproduct of the fact that I'm patient, present. I have the state of equanimity, right? And a
100%.
byproduct of that will be confidence and being able to act, not out of fear, to act out it. So yeah, yeah, I love that, dude. I really enjoyed this exercise. Yeah, what was the other one? Those were the two. Yeah, those were the two that I didn't actually cross out, but I just decided. So the
Yeah.
ambience of joy and the yes. Oh, dude, that was the one other one. I enjoy how I am doing things, which I thought that was an
Mm,
interesting one too. That was one of the
yeah.
last to get crossed out. Again, a byproduct of the other three, I believe.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
love it. My top three, the ones that, are mine. Like these are the ones that I cross everything out and found. So I am close with God. Enzo goes hiking with me every weekend,
Yes.
and I help a lot of people.
Hell yeah.
And what I found, all the things that were leading up to those things, if I have those three things, all those other things are happening.
Right.
And guys, if you do this exercise, what you're going to learn is what your internal and intrinsic motivation is, like what your ideal life is. And Matt, the next step is getting really, really deep and writing out everything you could possibly imagine what you would be doing in those three areas. Like if you
Mm,
were living peacefully, what would your day look like? What would you do? How would you act? How would you think? Who would you
mm,
talk to?
mhm,
Like write out an entire day of living peacefully, and then write out an entire day of what it would look like to live in abundant joy, and
mm,
write
mhm,
those things
mhm.
out, how you would be acting and thinking and feeling, and what you would be doing. And what you'll find is that you can have those things right now.
Yes.
Right now.
Oof. Beautiful. Love it. Love it.
Amen. Matt, thank you so much for being here, brother. Really enjoyed your podcast. This was a great conversation as well.
Yeah, man.
Guys, drop some love, drop some love. And where can they find you? I know we're going to have the podcast link, and where else can they find you?
Yeah, so recoveryroadmap.me. That's both my website and my Instagram handle. And I also have a YouTube channel, Facebook channel. It's Matt Gardiner Live. So those are my two easiest locations. And Adam, yeah, great collaboration. Really great to get to know you. I really appreciate you having me on. And yeah, loved your episode. It just came out today. At time of recording, we just released your episode for Beyond Recovery. And I'm super stoked to have that out there. It was a great episode.
Amen. Amen. And guys, love you all so much. Matt, thank you for being here. We will stay connected, and I'm sure that we'll do more episodes in the future. And guys, check out the show links in the show notes to stay connected with him if you want to do some story work or any other kind of coaching. Love you all. Talk to you soon. Keep living. Recovered on Purpose.